So for many people, January starts with a surge of optimism, right? It's a new year, and there's this cultural momentum to make changes, the changes we've been thinking about that we need in our lives. Gym memberships, for example, see a 25 to 30% jump because people want to take their health more seriously. But there is a shadow side to this ritual, to this New Year resolution ritual, and we all know what it is. We don't keep them, right? Studies have found that up to 80% of these new January gym memberships, the members quit within the first 5 months, with the biggest fall off happening in late February. It's not even 2 months in to the new year. And actually, 60 to 70% of gym memberships go completely unused. Fitness centers sign up many times the number of members that then can actually fit in their space because it's a business model that depends on people not keeping their commitments to themselves. But this effect isn't limited just to our desire to exercise more, right? Resolution studies have found that roughly 80% of New Year's resolutions are no longer being kept by mid-February, whether it's journaling or meditation or eating out less or being more frugal or even intangibles like, this year I'm going to resolve to be more patient or I'm going to listen better. And sometime in my late 30s or early 40s, I remember noticing a trend among a number of my friends who began to speak derogatively about New Year's resolutions, about no longer making them, about how they were stupid. And I can't help but wonder if this was happening not because resolutions are objectively stupid, but rather because they were trying to protect themselves from the future pain of letting themselves down. If I just start off by dismissing resolutions as a worthwhile aspiration, I don't have to wrestle with why I don't honor the commitments I make to myself, the ones that I believe will address a part of my life that I'm no longer content with. You know, some of this I do believe has to do with making the pressure of making unrealistic goals, like promising ourselves that we're going to go to the gym every day, for example, which creates an almost guaranteed failure point. Inevitably, we miss a day. This all-or-nothing mindset turns a single slip into total abandonment, and it's an approach that relies on willpower and doesn't factor in a solution for when our willpower wanes, which is unavoidable. It's going to happen. We're going to get sick, or we're going to have to deal with a breakup, or there's just stress at work. And there's an assumption that the change in the calendar will automatically change our character, a character and a set of behaviors that we've been cultivating, maybe even silently nurturing for many years. So it's really no surprise that we get a few decades into life and we find ourselves resistant to setting ourselves up for another round of failures. Who wants to start the new year by letting ourselves down once again? Now, this doesn't mean that we're content with leaving things as they are. Right? I recently went to a New Year's party, and I was so excited to pull out this sequined romper that I had in my closet. Yeah, that's what you heard. It's a sequined romper. It's amazing. But I hadn't worn it in a couple of years, and I found out that I'd eaten well. And my belly stretched the buttons in a way that they formed this little diamond-shaped hole exposing my navel. And I was unhappy. I was unhappy. But I also like olive oil and pasta. So I'm at a bit of a crossroads, and there's this gym right near my house that's running a special. So, there are these whole cottage industries and several best-selling books that have told us that making resolutions isn't the problem. It's the fact that there's no plan or accountability or specificity. And we're told it's about establishing a habit or a mindset like, I am a runner, to replace the thought of, I'm going to go running every morning. If our identity is on the line, then we're much more inclined to follow through because it's who we are rather than something we do. And there's a logic in this that speaks to me, which is probably why I've read a couple of these books. However, when I wasn't able to create the habit I wanted using the program laid out in the first book, I went and grabbed another one to see if that technique might work. And it didn't. I'm still not a runner. Which isn't to say I'm not a disciplined person. I am. I'm a disciplined person. But this was really about a technique, not transformation. And I think some of the issue with these resolutions and why they fail is because we treat ourselves like broken machines. Like if I just upgrade this part with a better diet or exercise or habit, then the machine will run better. But that's not really how transformation works. I don't just love olive oil and pasta. I mean, I do. I really love it. But I don't just love it. I like how they make me feel. I have a relationship with food that is complicated enough that a simple mechanical fix isn't going to address it. But exploring the deeper reasons behind my eating habits might be uncomfortable. Well, no, it is. It's not might be. It will be uncomfortable. I definitely eat to cope with stress, for example. And somehow, the idea of signing up for a gym, which I am not going to use because I don't like the gym, somehow feels more reasonable than making the effort to shift the patterns in my life that are actually causing me the stress that I'm coping with by eating. Richard Rohr talks about the transformation we're seeking often fails because we're trying to solve second half of life issues with first half of life solutions. And what he calls first half of our lives, which may not actually be the first half of your life at all in terms of years, but it's defined by building the container of who we are, establishing an identity and competence and boundaries and security. It's about learning the rules and gaining knowledge and ego structuring and willpower. And it's a technical way of moving through the world, right? But all of these things, and I don't discount any of it because all of them are critical to our success in life. The world has rules, right? You need to learn them. We need to learn them. And the ability to finish a project or to gain knowledge in our fields is really important for us to succeed in life. But the second half of life, or which, really, again, doesn't have to do with years, but sort of where we're at in our lives, the second half requires us to find the contents for that container that we created, that we built. So the contents that the container is designed to hold. And these are meaning, authenticity, service, sacrifice, compassion. The first half goals are about external validation and success and gaining a sense of control in one's life as we individuate from teenager to young adult and we move out of the home. Again, important things. The second half goals are about internal integrity, transformation over achievement. And the rub is that the method we use to cultivate our first half of life goals cannot deliver second half of life goals. The second half is often about facing what was avoided in the first half also, right? Which again, cannot be done using the tools that we have grown so familiar with. And maybe even have brought us success. Now, Albert Einstein once said, "No problem can be solved by the same consciousness that caused it in the first place." No problem can be solved by the same consciousness that caused it in the first place. Or there's that old maxim, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Right? But there are some issues that we are dealing with as we try to transition and transform our lives that cannot be beat into submission using a first half of life tool. It's just not going to work. If we want to grow up, if we want to grow wise, we need to set out on another pilgrimage at some point in our lives, one that leaves the hammer behind, because it may have served us as we built the container, but it cannot fill the container. The hammer cannot fill the container. But this is uncomfortable, and it feels like we don't have, we don't want to give up these early tools, right? Because we know them so well. And the truth is, most people don't. And as a result, they suffer. And when too many of us suffer, we create a culture of suffering. Carl Jung pointed out that so much of the suffering we see in the world, unnecessary suffering, is because people will not accept the legitimate suffering that comes with being human, that comes with growing up. Right? And he says that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering, meaning that when we suppress and repress the issues that we should be dealing with, the issues that are just part of the package of being a human being, the ones that we need to wrestle with as we go into this second half of life, we create pain in another area in the form of neurosis. And some of this is self-inflicted, and some of it has a bigger cultural impact. So in my situation, the sequined romper no longer fits because I'm not dealing with the bigger issue of my stress, and instead I'm eating to make myself feel better. But when I look out at the culture, I see this neurosis appearing in angry young men who found a tribe online and who are broadly characterized by the term incel. But what I actually see are men who are desperate for help. Men who are lonely and confused but don't know how to be vulnerable. The skills they are taught don't include this, and so they repress the loneliness and the confusion because we're not taught to cry. But these repressed emotions reappear as neurotic misogyny and violence. Or when I look at the anti-immigrant sentiment in Canada, a sentiment that is on the rise, I see people who don't know how to be angry at the political and economic elite, who destroyed the healthcare system, who aggressively moved manufacturing and service jobs overseas and replaced them with contract work, who used deregulation to avoid environmental and labor protections. We didn't get cheaper goods with deregulation, as we were promised. Things got more expensive than ever. But we did get stagnant wages, fewer benefits, and greater job insecurity. But it's too uncomfortable or too dangerous to hold the powerful accountable. Or maybe it's just too embarrassing to realize that we believed the lies that we were told. And nice Canadians don't say, eat the rich. That's for punk anarchists living in some squat, right? So instead, we say immigrants are the problem. Because it's safer, even if it doesn't deal with the problem. These are cultural neuroses. I eat a lot of olive oil and pasta, and it's making my clothes fit, and it's not an issue of willpower. I'm using it to cope with a lot of stress in my life. Some of it's the job. You guys stress me out. Love, but also true, right? Some of it's my relationships. I have aging parents. I'm not sure if I have enough money saved for retirement. But, some of it's also cultural. I don't know if I'm going to get permanent residency here, right? Because they keep changing the rules. And I may have to leave after investing a lot of myself here. I don't have a doctor. and I don't know when I'm going to get one. Housing is unaffordable. At 53, I don't know if I'll ever be able to own a home in Montreal, even if I do get to stay. And I have a relatively good job. But this didn't happen by accident. Some of my stress is because powerful political and economic actors reshaped the economy, defunded the social safety net to extract wealth upward, and then used propaganda to let frustration get misdirected downward at the powerless. We're living in some highly neurotic times, and New Year's resolutions aren't going to fix this. I'm glad you like that. It's true. We're experiencing, and maybe even worse, we're creating unnecessary suffering because we will not deal with the legitimate suffering that happens when we make the decision to be people of character, make the decision to grow up, right? Those who are familiar with the post-apartheid era of South Africa will remember that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was set up to investigate human rights abuses, allow victims to tell their stories, grant amnesty to perpetrators who confessed to politically motivated crimes, and really to foster national unity by restoring dignity and promoting forgiveness. That part, pretty famous. But the commission also created a register of reconciliation and invited ordinary citizens, especially those who benefited from or stayed silent during the injustice, to publicly express remorse and make a commitment to change. And it was designed as a way to off-gas guilt so that people would have the emotional space for positive commitments to build a better society together. The thinking was that if this guilt was repressed, then it would reappear as something worse than guilt. Now, it wasn't hugely popular. A few hundred people took part in it. But still, I love this idea because it not only offered a ritual of collective accountability for the nation where people were covenanting with themselves to cultivate a different future. More importantly, it shifted that future from something that was happening to them to something that flows through them. They went from passive actors and maybe even thinking of themselves as victims, which, gosh, we love to do that, right? To empowered citizens. Now, again, it wasn't hugely popular, but I choose to believe that those who engaged in this process became the future that they were trying to create. But I also love this idea because when people move from trying harder individually to making shared ongoing commitments around a greater vision, their success rates change dramatically. This is why people, I believe, are drawn to 12-step groups, for example. Try quitting drinking on your own. It's hard. So maybe initially they go to get sober, or they need to deal with debt or overeating. But often these people who join those groups stay to help someone else, right? It's the helping that ultimately becomes so important to them, the giving back that actually is the reward. It's the sharing of a future of freedom that really makes a change in their lives. I also think this is why fitness programs like Orange Theory or CrossFit or Soul Cycle find almost cult-like allegiance. I mean, we kind of joke about these folks, but they love their programs, right? Initially, you go to get healthy, but what happens is you become part of a tribe. And one of the reasons those gyms are so expensive is because it's a business model that is not built on having 67% of the paying customers not show up, right? These programs cost twice as much because they only have space for a fraction of the number. It's a business model that is designed to make sure that you go and find success, and that success is often defined as a communal experience. For those of you who do martial arts, you might see something similar in a dojo. An instructor might even call you up to ask why you didn't show up. Right? And that's because you are necessary for the future they collectively want to see. Not surprisingly, this is how I think about church. Not surprising. Now, we've talked a lot this year about empowering the members, empowering you to own and take leadership in your congregation. But I'm not talking about empowering a sense of individuality, but rather a melange that allows individuals to bring forth their unique gifts that elevate and empower the collective vision. This is about the crew coming together to make sure that we arrive where we are supposed to go, the adventure that we are all taking collectively. When a church moves beyond behavioral covenants, don't do this, do this, to covenants that let the future flow through us collectively, it can actually support people in confronting Moloch and acedia, the nihilistic devouring of our world by greed, and the spiritual malady that is draining our capacity to care. A church that nurtures collective identity empowers collective transformation. We are not people who come to church. We are a wisdom school. We are people who make room for legitimate suffering that is needed to grow up and grow wise. The world needs more wisdom, and it won't get it unless we become wise people, unless we allow the future to flow through us. Now, every faith is capable of doing this. Every faith has its own unique set of stumbling blocks to overcome for the empowered vision of the community to appear. And for Unitarian Universalists, more often than not, in my opinion, that stumbling block is that by nature we are anti-authoritarian. Anti-authoritarian. Yeah, everybody's like, oh yeah, that's true. We have a complicated relationship with belonging because we are fiercely independent. Now, some of us came by this anti-authoritarianism honestly. That is, we earned it because we were traumatized by early experiences that left us distrustful of authority. But each of us came to our own anti-authoritarianism in some small part due to the traumas created in our culture by religious and political and social forces. And we needed this anti-authoritarianism to help us find a safer place. And I get it. I'm okay with it. I feel the same way. But what we needed at an earlier stage becomes a hindrance when we can no longer let it go after it's no longer useful, when it starts to get in our way of allowing the future to flow through us. And I cannot tell you the number of UU churches that spin themselves into irrelevance and even non-existence because they won't find a collective vision that they can agree on, one that isn't about technical fixes like getting a better website, but instead focused on the transformation that they want flowing through them. And I can't tell you the number because I think it's the majority of them. The majority of our churches are spiraling into irrelevance, and it's sad. For many years, one of our most popular curriculums was called Build Your Own Theology, which makes a lot of sense for people who are trying to recover from religious trauma, whether this was the church that raised them or the larger, cultural trauma. But I understand, and I understand why everybody wants to have the freedom to build their own theology. But it's not surprising also that nobody feels like we're moving in the same direction if everyone is building their own theology. We are so attached to the first half of life techniques that we don't have room for the second half of life meaning making, which happens together. It happens together. And this is why most Unitarian Universalist churches are shrinking. It's why most churches in general are shrinking. It's not because Canadians are less spiritual. Canadians are just as spiritual as they have always been, even if church attendance doesn't reflect that. In fact, the youngest generation right now of adults, those in their 20s, are twice as interested in attending some form of religious community than Canadians in their 40s. The culture is getting more desirous of being religious, not less. But the anti-institutionalism found in many UU communities is not allowing us to be a home for these seekers because they want to belong to a larger vision, not build their own theology on their own. So you have a choice, right? Do you want to keep things as they've always been done, which is the more comfortable option, right? It allows you to continue to use the tools that you've cultivated your whole life. But it may mean that you continue to shrink and lose relevance in the eyes of the next generation that is seeking meaning and purpose. Or do you set out on the second half of life pilgrimage and leave behind some of the comfortable narratives? I'm going to give you one that I've chosen just to upset you. I think the term atheist is irrelevant. I think it's irrelevant. Atheist of what? Odin? Ra? Jupiter? Atheist of what? Most people mean Adonai, or what we just call God, right? And sure, I am an atheist of that God too. I am an atheist of all those gods that I just named. But to me, it's kind of an irrelevant term because I don't want to define myself by what I don't believe in. Instead, I'm trying to find the bigger vision of what I do believe in. Some of you know that I call it my darling, and you'll hear about this more in 2 weeks, right? My darling. But I'm tired of defining myself by what I'm not, and one of the reasons I think UU churches are increasingly irrelevant is because the younger generation is looking for something to believe in, not something that helps them find further separation and distinction, right? They are too lonely and isolated as it is. We are all too lonely and isolated as it is. They want to belong. We want to belong. So what are you going to offer them to belong? Choosing your own religion is not it. It's not. You've got to find something better. But remember, there is nothing to fix, right? Because we're not broken machines. We are human beings, transforming as we enter the second half of what we have been called to do with this precious life.